It was just after midnight when China's notorious secret police came knocking on his door. It was this late-night visit to Michael Smith's Shanghai Langway house that triggered a diplomatic storm, which abruptly ended his stint as one of Australia's last foreign correspondents in China. After 5 days under consular protection, Smith was evacuated from a very different China to the country he first visited 23 years earlier. So Michael Smith is the guest on today's podcast. He's the author of The Last Correspondent, which is a story so tantalizingly teased by that little introduction there. He's the Chinese correspondent for the Australian Financial Review and has put together one of the most readable books on the current state of China. He's really a terrific writer. Praise for the book has come from all around, but most notably for me, where I found the book was praise from Geoff, Raby, former guest on this podcast and former Australian ambassador to China. The chat was really fun. We covered, I think, a lot of his life in Asia and China specifically. You know, he's had some wild experiences from a sort of from a wedding straight out of Crazy Rich Asians, a propaganda tour through the Xinjiang province. Interviewing Jack Ma, having an insight into the disappearing billionaires, getting an insight into China's untangleable web of an economy, insights into the differing accounting methods between China and the rest of the world, which is a massive reason why they have these unbelievable GDP figures, and really so much more. That's just a tease to some of the things we spoke about. Obviously, the big drama to Michael's experience in China was this abrupt ending. He was expelled from the nation. And what's most notable about it is that he wasn't expelled because of something he did. He didn't do something specifically bad according to the CCP. No, it was a pawn that represents the deteriorating relationship between Australia, his nation, and my nation, and China. According to Michael and many other people, our relationship is at the worst point it has ever been. But first, a message to you, the dear listener, whose ears I am currently speaking into. Let's assume we have similar interests, okay? So we've reached here together. That predisposes at least one thing we have in common, an interest in China, or an interest in Michael Smith, or an interest in The Last Correspondent, or perhaps just a general interest in podcasting. And that's really quite a cool thing that I don't want to discount. There's so many things we could be giving our attention to, but I'm lucky that you have decided to give this podcast attention. So let's double down. Let's assume we have more similar interests. And to express that, I would love for you to share this with a friend who, similarly to you, is excited by a differing range of topics and ideas and interests that go well beyond whatever the typical might be. So whether it is this or something else that I've already covered on the podcast, please share it with them. I really want to corner the podcast market for eclectic curiosities in whatever country it is you are listening in from. Based off the email correspondence I've had with some listeners of this podcast, the listenership is an accumulation of extremely brilliant, smart, and curious people, and I am so honored to be in such good company. It is so cool the type of serendipity this podcast has created in the short time it's been around. I want to double down and triple down and compound this serendipity. So share this podcast with a mate, but more importantly, pump your good juice into the algorithm, subscribe to this podcast, and leave a review wherever it is you're listening in from. And hang around to the end to hear some afterthoughts from the chat as well. And without any further ado, here is Michael Smith. Well, Michael Smith, good evening to you in Sydney. Thank you so much for giving me some of your time.
Morning, Ryan. Thanks for having me on.
Mate, it's an absolute pleasure. I really, really mean it. I first came across you. Sorry, I wasn't a long-time reader of AFI. I guess I just never was subscribed or anything like that. But in a podcast you did after your book was released, The Last Correspondent, I think it was with Please Explain, the Sydney Morning Herald podcast. And given my interest in China, which has been manifest recently through a number of interviews, I thought, well, that's exactly the story that I want to learn more about. So I went out, immediately consumed your book, thought it was brilliant, and now we get to speak about it, which is amazing. So There are four distinct chapters that don't really overlap, but I would like to somehow talk about it at some stage. And that is obviously the finance and business of China, because that is your bread and butter, and that's also a fascinating story in its own right. Some of the wild experiences, like the wedding, Hong Kong back in the day, Unite in North Korea, some of this sort of stuff.
Yeah.
The politics of China, which is obviously itself a giant chapter, and then the relationships between Australia and China, which is now, I guess, also welled into your bread and butter as well. So,
Yeah.
with that being said, as sort of like a context, hopefully that we can frame the chat around, I just will ask, first of all, you say in your book that paradoxically, China gets harder to understand the longer that you live there. So you live there for a long time. You're a correspondent there for a long time. Could you open up on this for us as a way to introduce China as this crazy wild world that we just can't understand in Australia or in Sweden?
Yeah, look, that's a great way to open it up. And look, I think everyone who's lived in China for any amount of time says this. I mean, you sort of you arrive in China all sort of bright eyed, and you soak everything up, and you think you're sort of getting a handle on the place, and then something happens, and you think, God, I've still got no idea what's happening in this sort of really complex. Um, Bewildering, sometimes frustrating country. And I found, I mean, in the end, I'd been in China on and off for years, but my last stint I did 3 years. But I knew people, correspondents, and other people that had been there for 20 years, and they still didn't understand what was going on in China. And I guess it's hard to explain why that is. It's such a multi-layered country, huge, long cultural history, but also, culturally complex, sometimes a bit difficult for us Westerners to understand, and overlaid with that, with the vast changes that have happened in China in just the last sort of, well, since the Cultural Revolution, really, just the last sort of 30, 40, 50 years, this rapid fire pace of change, which is really hard for anyone born there to keep up with. And then, of course, the Communist Party system, the one-party political system you've got there as well. So the whole thing combined is very complicated.
Mm. But what does it mean to not understand? Is this in a cultural aspect, or is this more from a business aspect? Obviously, it's all wrapped into one. But could you try and just elucidate for us a little bit what that might look like? Because the longer someone is in a place, you would think you start to be like, this is kind of how it works. This is how people react to these sort of things. But it's seemingly you learn less and less the longer you're there.
Yeah, I mean, that's also said a bit tongue in cheek. Obviously, if you're there for a good amount of time, you do have a reasonable handle on what's going on there. And I mean, I used to interview a lot of business people who would come into China, and the guys that have been there for 20 years did have a bit of a grasp of the situation. But I think if you're an entrepreneur coming into China for the first time, it is very difficult. I mean, I think there was a period there up until a few years ago, you had this assumption you could swoop in and have a few banquets with your business partners and make oodles of money. But you've got this very complex system of, this very opaque legal system, which isn't always that reliable. Contracts don't really mean anything. It's often hard to trust people, but that's just from the business side. And I guess culturally, I mean, I had a lot of good Chinese friends, very close to a lot of Chinese people. But often there were just sort of quirky things that would happen, and you think, well, why is this happening? And the rules would sort of often change quite often. But look, it's a wonderful country. I know, the headlines we read are often quite negative, but Chinese people are wonderful people. They're all human beings like us, and I've tried to get that across in my book. And it's it's a really colourful, quirky country. That there's a dark side as well too, but I guess we can get into that later.
Yeah, a very dark side. But I do want to reaffirm that distinction as well. There is a huge difference between China, the Chinese culture, the Chinese people, and the Chinese Communist Party and their policies. The government is never really a reflection of the people. People and their culture is a separate to the handful of people in China, which is a wild case, genuinely a handful of people that run the whole system, more or less. You said contracts don't really mean anything. Can you open up on that a little bit? How does that work?
Well, I guess a lot of business people have told me this over time. I mean, there are. I think if you go in and do a deal or a joint venture, that there are contracts. I guess what people are implying there is that they can often be broken. Promises can be broken. There's sort of a minefield of other issues to navigate.
Mm,
You've got to have good relationships with maybe local government officials, or people in your company have to have good relationships with local government officials. So there's sort of a lot more to it than just having a black and white contract, that if someone breaks, you can take them to court. I think
sure.
taking anyone to court in China is just a minefield on its own if you don't understand the system. I mean, I've never had to do it, thank God.
Yeah.
I think, I mean, one positive thing is the age of sort of government corruption. That is one thing that Xi Jinping did tackle. So I think the good old days of having to bribe local government officials, etc., that's probably ended to a point. But
Okay.
it's just
Interesting.
but it's sort of all those things.
Yeah. I wonder with reporting on the financial business angle of China. In your book, you mention interviews with Jack Ma and other business types, especially also foreign business types in the country. And you're also having dinner with these people, and being introduced to the expat community that comes through and so forth. How much truth is there to the narrative that has come out since COVID-19 that China's numbers are quite untrustworthy? And now, obviously, that specifically was to do with COVID cases, COVID responses, COVID deaths,
Mm.
whatever. But historically, there's also sort of been a lot of a grey smoke over GDP figures and those economic indicators.
Mm.
In your experience, how much can you rely on them?
Yeah, there's a lot of grey areas there. I mean, I think we used to always say, look, we can do is to use the Chinese data as a guide, as sort of a litmus test, as a way to sort of read trends. So I don't think you speak to any good economists about who study China, and look, I don't think we can ignore the numbers completely. I don't think anyone does. I think, of course, there's some element of truth to them. I mean, I think over the years, we've had to be very skeptical of the GDP numbers. You've got to be
Yeah.
skeptical out of the numbers coming up from the local provincial governments as well, because obviously it's in every local official's interest to produce a good a set of numbers as humanly possible. So I think over the years, you do look at the numbers with a bit of skepticism. But having
Yeah.
said that, I mean, China's economic growth, there is no doubt that it's real. I mean,
Hmm.
you travel around the country as you have, and you see all this infrastructure, and people's lives have really changed
Hmm.
dramatically. So the wealth creation is genuinely there. But it's hard to, it's not like when the Australian government puts out a set of data, you sort of assume that's pretty much true. In
Cut and
China,
dry. Exactly. Yeah.
take it with a grain of salt. And every economist uses different ways to measure this. I mean, I think the guys at Capital Economics have their own particular index where the GDP data comes out, and they'll say, well, we've measured it a different way, and it's actually a couple of percent lower than what they're saying.
Mm.
There was a classic case just near the beginning of the pandemic, when China was coming out of lockdown in April last year, and the factories were all coming back to life. So the Chinese government was producing all this data saying, look, we're roaring back to life. Our factories are sort of running at full throttle. And it sort of emerged that a lot of factories had sort of been instructed to flick the power on. They had the power on, the electricity on, but they weren't actually producing anything.
Right.
And then that came through in the data. It was sort of like the electricity numbers were really high, and that was sort of held up as an example of the economy recovering when perhaps it
Right.
actually wasn't. Yeah.
Yeah. Do you have any insight into accounting differences between how China does it and say Australia, the US, Europe, and so forth?
In terms of sort of cut companies or listed companies, or just in terms of the government.
Done at a national level. I'll just
Yeah.
I'll ask the question why, rather than like
Mm.
trap you with saying yes, I understand. But I heard this. A guest came on recently and explained it, and partly why China has not just great GDP growth figures, but borderline unbelievable GDP growth figures year on year on year on year, is because they don't do the sort of retractive accounting method where if you spend a lot of money on a piece of infrastructure, say, for example, in Sweden, they just built this giant bridge, very famously in the center of Stockholm, or in China, a ghost city, for example.
Mm.
Next year, we're going to go back and measure the productivity of this bridge and say, wow, it's actually less than we had projected. Therefore, this is a strike against our income. And then in China, supposedly, they just will report it as it was projected and not actually take into account the livability, not the livability, the productivity that this place was supposed to have.
Yeah.
And therefore, it's a very, not very clever actually, but it's a nifty way to project amazing growth, because look, we built an entire city, but if no one lives there and it produces nothing, then that's not worth anything.
Yeah.
Is there any truth to this?
Yeah, there absolutely is. I haven't studied the accounting intricacies in details, but look, that's absolutely right. And a classic example
Cool. That's cool to hear.
is China's ghost cities, where and you see it. My last job in China before I got evacuated, we flew to a place called Tianjin, which is just outside Beijing, and that's famous for it built, 8 years ago or so. It just built thousands and thousands of skyscrapers full of apartment blocks, and there were these notorious ghost cities, and we'd heard they were still empty, so we went back. We're about to go there and sort of investigate whether these huge monolithic dystopian sort of cities had people in them or not, and we suspect they didn't. So that definitely happens, and you saw it after the GFC, especially. I mean, China really pumped its economy. It flooded it with stimulus, built a lot of things, and that's how it got through that sort of tricky period in time. And I think now, though, we've seen a bit of a shift in the last sort of year or two, a bit of a more measured approach to the way that China manages its economy. I think it realizes, its leaders realize it's gone through this sort of period of extraordinary growth, and it does have to slow things down a bit. It's got huge amounts of debt, as you know, and that's still a real concern for the Chinese government. So I think what we've seen in the last year or two is sort of a bit of a more conservative approach in terms of sort of fiscal stimulus. It's still happening, but it's just not as rampant as it used to be in the old days.
Yeah. I saw an explainer video from Economics Explained the other day. I'm not sure if you're familiar with them. It's actually an Australian who runs the channel, but it's one of the most popular economics channels on YouTube. And he was talking about home ownership in China. And obviously with Australia, it's like written into our DNA that we must own property. This is the one thing that sort of validates you as like a good citizen. And apparently it's similarly so in China, even more so because, like a woman won't even go on a date with you unless you own a property or something like this. Could you comment on that culture, on that, whether that's culturally true, and also what implications that then has on a local economy? Because you then have inflated price houses and shit like that.
No, definitely. And China's got this hugely overheated property market, which is something that the government's sort of starting to try and address now. But I guess, for example, living in Shanghai, I mean, the Shanghai property market, it was sort of Sydney on steroids. And you'd have these families or a young couple or a young single person in their late 20s under huge amount of pressure to buy an apartment. And these apartments would cost more than they would cost in a Western country, in Sydney or Melbourne or even New York. But their salaries, I don't have the data off the top of my head, but their salaries were a lot lower than what people are earning in those countries. So paying back the value of these properties and getting the mortgage and everything, huge amounts of financial pressure on young families. And I remember, we went around different parts of China. I remember going to a city called Chengdu and interviewing, just sort of workers, and they were talking about the huge pressure they're under. They had to find the money to send their child to university and then pay off the mortgage. And I remember one taxi driver sort of ran through what he spent his money on, and he had hardly anything left for sort of basic food and that kind of thing. So yeah, huge amount of pressure in China.
Not sustainable, is it? Not sustainable. You take that into account. You take what you said into account before that. China's growth is slowing. You take into account the fact that the rest of the world, who are traditionally China's customers, being the US, Europe, Australia, are starting to err on a side of skepticism with buying Chinese products, and they could just as easily move manufacturing from, say, China to Turkey. With my company, for example, I'm trying to get all manufacturing through to Turkey now rather than China.
Mm.
And I know I'm not the only person thinking that way.
Mm.
This is a lot of compounding factors, which is potentially going to imply that China are right on the precipice of a serious economic collapse, because the only thing keeping them afloat is their just, throbbing demand. But if that dies off, I mean, what are the bad implications here? What
Mm.
happens?
Well, I'm not sure. I mean, a lot of people have been saying China's economy is going to collapse for sort of many, many years, and then it just never does. Um, and and in a way, you're right. China's sort of losing a bit of its gloss in terms of being a manufacturing hub, etc. It is becoming more expensive.
Mm.
I think the Chinese government is scaring off a lot of foreign companies with really onerous regulation, and you just don't know. Every business decision they make seems to be politicized now, so that's a huge risk for companies going into China. But I think it's still going to be a manufacturing hub for many years, and of course there are other alternatives like Turkey and Vietnam and what have you. But
Mm.
I speak to a lot of companies, and they say, look, we've tried other locations, and China's still the only one that works for us, and people still seem to want Chinese made products. It's still the factory of the world. So I think it's got a little way to run yet. I mean, there's a whole
Yeah.
bunch of
Yeah.
potential risks.
It's
The
definitely still
property,
cheaper.
yeah.
Definitely still cheaper.
And it's definitely slowing. I mean, the Chinese economy is undoubtedly slowing, and the GDP growth is slowing down every year, and that's going to continue, I think, to moderate. But there's a whole raft of different arguments about whether China's going to be the world's biggest economy, by 2030 or whenever, or whether it is
Hmm.
actually going to slow down, because it's also got a lot of other problems. It's got an aging population. It's got huge demographic issues.
Hmm.
The shadow banking sector, the lending sector is still a bit dodgy. So it's still got a lot of challenges there.
Can you open up on the shadow banking?
Yeah, I mean, this has been something that's been probably worrying the authorities in China for a long time. I mean, this is this is a whole segment of the Chinese banking sector that lent vast amounts of money to businesses and individuals and others for years. Very opaque regulations, very sort of under-regulated. And there were fears for quite a long time that could explode. And I mean, I was doing stories, I remember 2 or 3 years ago. There was a run on a couple of banks, provincial banks in China, and everyone sort of said, oh my God, this is the beginning of the end. People are
Hmm.
scrambling to get their money out. And then nothing actually happened. I mean, I'm sort of erring on the side of caution. I think that the Chinese government has proven so far that it's somehow it's got the resources and the capability to sort of manage these sort of big challenges.
Hmm.
And I don't think the whole system's going to fall down and crack soon. I think it's sort of slowly trying to get sort of that lending sector under control, but it's still got a way to play out.
Interesting. I really had no insight into that, but it wouldn't surprise me if their shadow banking is more or less similar to the rest of the world's shadow banking. Are you
Yeah.
familiar with Nicholas Shaxson and Treasure Island?
Oh, not a little bit, but not in detail.
So
Mm.
this is huge interest of mine at the moment, and it's
Mm.
essentially the very dirty, very grubby depraved world of tax evasion, and tax evasion on its surface doesn't seem that grubby because
Yeah.
any reasonable person is going to try and avoid giving money away to a government that they think doesn't spend it efficiently. However, there's more to it than that,
Yeah.
because there's a difference between an individual evading his taxable income and a corporation evading their corporate taxable income, and it allows criminal organizations to scale to the scale and heights that they can scale to, and also depletes the most developing parts of the world. And so I just wanted to open up if there was something special about the Chinese shadow banking system. I imagine not really. It's probably very similar to the way that Manhattan corporations will report their income in, say, Jersey. So anyway, I want to really open up on everything you're saying, but I am conscious of just like taking advantage of your goodwill and your time. Are you okay to just like, if we just talk for a long time, it's no problem?
No problem. I'm in lockdown in Sydney, so happy
Amazing.
to
Well, then in
not going
that
anywhere.
case,
I'm
let's
not about
definitely
to go
touch.
out to the pub or anything. Yeah.
Okay. Well, in that case, let's definitely open up on the demographics as well.
Yeah.
So, could you explain to the listener why the aging population is such a hard problem to get around?
That's right. I can't remember the numbers, but it's a real challenge for China, and the root cause of this is the one child policy, which all your listeners have probably heard about.
Mm-hmm.
So the one child policy introduced by Deng Xiaoping, which would only allow Chinese families to have one children. It was a little bit too successful. I mean, it really did work.
Mm.
It was a brutal policy in terms of sort of human
Mm.
rights abuses. There's
Oh, for
awful
sure.
stories out there, but it actually did work, and it really stopped the population growth. And then I think it was about 5-6 years ago, they eased those restrictions. They said, "Hey guys, you can all have two children," and then no one did. So I think in the first year there was a little bit of a spike in the birth rate, and then it just went down again. So families just didn't want more than one child. They were just sticking to one child, and I interviewed a lot of Chinese families about this, and particularly amongst the middle classes, they can't afford to have more children. They're living in small apartments. They devote a lot of their energy and money to their kids' education. They all have grandparents around helping to look after the kids, and they all seem pretty happy with just having one child. And the
Mm.
government's moved to open that up even further more recently. They're encouraging people to have three children or more. But anyway, as a result of this, it is a fairly elderly population, and we're just seeing that filter through now. Huge number of retirees, and the size of the sort of younger workforce is just going to shrink. So it's not an immediate problem, but it's going to be a big burden on China in sort of 10 or 20 years' time. They don't have migrants coming into the country to do the labour. A lot of the labour is done by what they call migrant workers, who are sort of poorer workers from rural parts of China who come and work in the cities, but they don't have labour coming in from externally from other countries. So eventually they're going to sort of have this big problem on their hands.
Mm. And the implications is that if there aren't enough taxable receipts being generated by fewer people to pay for the pensions of the older people, then everything sort of falls in on itself.
That's right. Yeah, sort of labour shortages. Lack of tax coming in, lack of income. I mean, I guess one cushion is in Chinese society, people do tend to look after their elderly, and
Sure.
older people normally live with their kids. So there'd be less pressure on the system there than say Australia would have. But I guess Japan's had this sort of similar issue. It's just amplified in China that there's a lot more people.
Yeah, that's the great thing about China, isn't it? Everything is just done on a whole nother scale. I mean, 1.4 billion people. It's how many X of Australia? It is unbelievable to think about the type of numbers you're dealing with when it comes to China. Like, for example, I don't remember the figures off the top of my head now either. But with the one-child policy, which is, in my opinion, one of the most inhumane government policies in history,
Yeah.
just because of the incentives that it creates. Because
Mm.
in a culture that values sort of men over women, and in a culture that, in a culture that has men over women,
Mm.
a lot of girls born first were given away or
Yeah.
much worse things.
Yeah.
And you now have an imbalance of, I think, 40 million more men than women.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's two Australias of just men who,
Yeah.
even if, they'll even if they were, even if literally there's no one left for them. And this is such a bad problem if you think about what that
Yeah.
can do to a culture, what it can do to a community. And I think the case is a lot of these men are, they're part of this now immigrant workforce, right? Because
Mm.
in the Chinese culture, it's very important to have a wife, right? And it's very
Yeah.
important to signal these sort of things. And
Yeah.
so, yeah, is there any truth to that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, family comes above everything in China, and that's just a traditional part of Chinese culture. There's huge amounts of pressure to, by the time you hit your mid to late 20s, there's huge amounts of pressure to go and get married and start having kids. And I had a lot of friends who experienced that. And I mean, a new phenomenon you're seeing in the city, the wealthier cities like Shanghai and Beijing, a lot of women don't want to get married. They want to have really good careers and save money
Mm.
and buy an apartment. So that leaves even more men sort of hanging dry.
Mm.
It is a real problem. A female scholar in China earlier this year wrote up this proposal. She said that women should be allowed to have two husbands, and that would fix the problem. But obviously, that's never going to
What
happen.
a bold woman. I love that. That should actually be enacted.
Yeah, yeah,
Reverse polygamy.
yeah, yeah.
Okay, yeah, and so a way that you could get around a demographic problem is through migration, right? Like the US has famously done, Europe has done, and Australia should do more of.
Yeah.
Like just letting people that want to work, right?
Mm.
Um, China, could you explain from a cultural perspective why there is such a stance against migration?
Yeah, that's a good question, and it wasn't an issue I wrote a lot about, but I sort of wish I had. And there's a bit of a thing going on in China. The Han Chinese are sort of the dominant race in China, the dominant culture. There are other immigrant cultures. There's the Muslims in Xinjiang, famously. There's Mongolians. China has a lot of different ethnic minority groups, but they're pretty small. And look, I think there would be a resistance to migration. There'd certainly be a suspicion of migrants, and obviously, the usual expat types, the Caucasians and whatever have been coming into China for years. And look, foreigners are
Mm,
generally fairly welcome in China. It's not quite like that, but that's more sort of to getting into white collar jobs,
sure,
and but I just can't see sort of mass migration happening in China. It could do if things get desperate there and they need
sure,
it.
yeah,
But
yeah.
it's just not part. It's sort of not part of the psyche there in the way that it is in a country, say like Australia, where we're just sort of used to it. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Um, so I said earlier that you got to interview Jack Ma and many other business figures. You wrote in your book that Jack had this sort of star effect on you, something that you would rarely get. Um, Through your understanding of Jack Ma, could you explain what has happened to him
Mm.
since Ant's last minute cancellation? And then give us an insight into Chinese disappearing billionaires.
Mm. Yeah, that was really interesting. I mean, I was very lucky to get an interview with him. He's, China's second most famous man after Xi Jinping, and
Mm.
China's most successful entrepreneur. And I sort of requested an interview, and he miraculously agreed to do it. He has a lot of affection for Australia. He came here when he was very young, so I think that helped. And look, he's a fascinating character. You've probably seen him on television. He's sort of this very small guy, but he's very he's very sprightly, and he's very energetic, and he's very philosophical. He doesn't really talk like a typical businessman in China. He's not particularly conservative, and when I spoke to him, he'd get very deep and philosophical about his place in the world and the obligations of the wealthy to give back, and how he hated being in the limelight. But I think what was going on at the time, which we weren't aware of, is that I think Jack Ma was under a lot of pressure to step down as CEO from his company. He had announced that he was going to do that. He wanted to focus on entrepreneurism. But it seems now that he'd become a little bit too big for his boots, maybe. He was really up there on a pedestal, very well recognized internationally. He'd be up on stage with presidents and members of royal families and things like that. And this wasn't going down too well with the Chinese government. So this came to the fore in November last year. So it was sort of about 18 months after I met him. And it really shocked markets around the world. The Chinese government overnight pulled the Ant Financial IPO. So this was the financial services spin-off of Jack Ma's company Alibaba. Yeah. It's going to be the world's biggest IPO ever, I think. New York,
yeah,
Hong Kong
exactly.
listing. And it came about because Jack Ma gave this speech where he was he's always been pretty outspoken, and he was critical of the Chinese banking system and the way regulation worked in China. And, he compared them to pawn shops. So that went down very badly. And look, they might have pulled the IPO anyway. This seemed to be the last straw. Sure. And then the more disturbing thing was that Jack Ma sort of disappeared for a good 3 months after that. And look, we don't know where he was. I've been told that he was actually detained somewhere. I mean, I think he's back in public now, but he's really had to withdraw from his company. And look, this is the Chinese government, the Chinese Communist Party, is currently not waging war on capitalism, but it's certainly taking a different approach to capitalism than what we saw in the last 10 or 20 years. I think it wants wealth to be distributed more evenly around the country. Xi Jinping gave a speech, I think a week or two ago, where he was sort of talking about wealth distribution. Tencent, another big tech company, since that speech, they've come out and said they're going to give a lot of their profits away. So I think there's a lot of pressure now on China.
Okay.
Yeah, China's sort of, if you're too successful in China, it can now be a bad thing. For many years, it wasn't. I think China needed its billionaires, its entrepreneurs to, get the economy really, really booming, which worked. But I think now the government's gone, well, we're in a good place now. It's time to, these guys have become a little bit too influential. The Communist Party is completely paranoid. I mean, that they want to control everything. So they don't want these very powerful and influential and wealthy entrepreneurs running around having a say in things. So that's sort of what's going on here.
That's would make for a fascinating cross-cultural study of how eventually everyone just starts hating rich people. We really liked James Packer. I mean, it's before my generation, but I know that he was a very well-respected man and people respected what he did. And then now people don't like his son or like Gina Reinhardt or like Jeff Bezos and I feel like in most countries, it's sort of like there is a life cycle. And it sounds like in China, certainly you say Jack Ma was the second most recognized person. My understanding was that people really admired him because he had made it. And they didn't care that he had $100 billion. They were like, give him more, he's made it. And now it sounds like if Tencent are just going to be redistributing profits, I mean, that is a very... That is a move antithesis to you're making it. It's almost like they're coming full circle now on that as well. That's really interesting to hear, actually. Because isn't that also? It's like it's really fundamental to the Chinese culture. I like the notion of working really hard. There's a famous Chinese proverb: "No man who rises before dawn 360 days a year cannot feed his family."
Yeah,
I butchered that, but basically the notion that
if you on your website,
you're going to be okay.
Yeah,
Mm,
I saw that on your website, and it's so true. And look, you've got to remember the Chinese government got a lot of credit for getting China where it is and getting people out of poverty. But the Chinese people are very hardworking. I mean, that um, I know I've met Chinese people in their 50s who, they've been working hard their entire lives. They threw everything into their companies. A lot of young Chinese parents often left their kids with the grandparents in other cities so they could go to a bigger city and work. So work really was everything and at the core
mm,
of the country's values, and it has got the country sort of into a good place. Not that all work and no play isn't necessarily healthy, as we know, but there has been a bit of a shift. And I remember, when I got to China, people would actually have pictures of Jack Ma on their in their
unreal,
home.
eh?
And then
Yeah.
last year there was all this stuff on social media, sort of, which the government was obviously encouraging, being critical of Jack Ma and other billionaires. So
Yeah.
it's precarious to be too wealthy anymore in China, maybe.
Fascinating. What about an insight into the other disappearing billionaires? I have a list here of just three names: Ren Shiquang, Xiao
Mm,
Xinwei, and Meng Hongwei. I don't know if
yeah,
they resonate with you at all, but
yeah.
it is well documented, isn't it, that very, very established businessmen, owners of large state-run companies,
Mm,
disappear because they
yeah,
say something they shouldn't have.
yeah. Yeah. So those three people you mentioned, yeah, what they all have in common is that they were publicly critical of the authorities, and in some cases of Xi Jinping personally. I think one of them referred to him as a clown last year somewhere, and yes, suddenly they face corruption charges, or their company's done something
Hmm.
dodgy, and there's a court case, and they get sentenced to often 18 years in jail. So
Hmm. Hmm.
it's all obviously linked to the politics. And I think other powerful Chinese businessmen do. They don't necessarily disappear, but they sort of fall from grace,
Right.
and we probably don't even hear about them all. And that's partly because they've become a little bit too powerful as well. Look, not everyone. There's thousands of billionaires in China still, and they're all doing absolutely fine. So it's not
Sure.
everyone, but you just got to be really careful. I mean, there was a case. Even movie stars and famous people aren't exempt. There was China's most famous actress, a woman called Fan Bingbing. I think it was a year or two ago. She got done for tax evasion. They wanted to make an
Hmm.
example of the movie industry because there was a lot of tax dodging going on, and she
Sure.
got arrested and she disappeared for 3 months, and then came back and made a confession on her social media account, and then went back to work, and the
It's wild, isn't it?
public didn't bat
It's
an eyelid.
Yeah,
Mm,
yeah. That's so wild because we can so flippantly just give these examples. Man makes lots of money, woman becomes very famous, but they're just given a tap on the shoulder and
yeah,
taken away.
yeah,
Um, that I think that's what creates so much mystique and intrigue around China because that's unfathomable in our societies.
mm,
And so our societies being Australia, Sweden, America, Mexico, whatever. Um, and I don't know. I think maybe that, at least for me, generates a lot of interest that
yeah.
something like that could be possible. One more on the finance business angle. Can you explain how significant China's use of special economic zones were in generating the behemoth globalized economy that we now know of as China, second largest economy in the world, and what
Mm.
role special economic zones played in making them so big?
Yeah, no, they were hugely important. And I mean, Deng Xiaoping famously, I can't remember the year, he famously opened the country's first special economic zone in Shenzhen. It must have been back in the 80s. And that really kickstarted China's economy, and really opened up China to the world. Because you've got to remember, before these zones were set up, I mean, China was a bit of a closed shop. It was very hard to trade with China and import export with China. So these zones changed all that. They cut through the red tape. And look, there's quite a few special economic zones in China today, and they're still really important. They're not as important as they used to be, but they're still are really important, just in terms of breaking down the trade barriers and tariffs and taxes and what have you. So they've all been quite important. I mean, China's still today really, I think, trying to promote Hainan Island, this sort of tropical island in the south, as sort of the next big special economic zone. So they still have a
Interesting.
role to play. Yeah.
What do they sort of say that their plans are for this island?
Well, I think at one stage, I mean, the thing is, the Chinese government, there's a lot of rhetoric and a lot of promises. And I mean, the whole time I was there was a lot of talk about, reform and opening up, and promises to foreign companies that life would become easier for them and they should do more with China. And it's actually become, in a way, it's become more difficult for a lot of companies to deal with China. There's a lot more regulation. There's certainly no special privileges for foreign companies coming into China. It's still very hard to have more than 50% of a joint venture. All of those things, they're changing the tax laws that make it less attractive for expatriates to work in China. So there are a lot of obstacles there. But I think in terms of Hainan Island, I mean, I think there was a lot of talk of really opening the whole place up, giving it a lot more freedoms, not having the firewall in place that you have in the rest of China. But to be honest, I just can't see it happening. I think China, since the pandemic, I think China's actually becoming a bit more of a closed shop.
Let's take a bit of a dark transition. So something that stood out to me from the book was what you wrote about Xi Jinping's ambition actually not being obvious from the start. And to quote from the book, you said, Xi did not turn left, nor did he turn right. Instead, he turned bad.
Yeah.
So can you open up on that for us, please?
Yeah, that quote was from a Chinese academic, a dissident who actually lives in Sydney now. And it's a great quote because it really sums it up. And I think when before Xi came into power, of course, all of us in the West, none of us had any idea who he was. No one had heard of him. But in China, he was the son. They call them princelings. He was the son of a very prominent party member who back in the time was seen as being sort of fairly liberal. So I think when Xi came in, there was a sort of an assumption he was a safe pair of hands, and in fact he would be quite a liberal president in the vein that perhaps Deng Xiaoping was. But it turned out he wasn't at all. I mean, his true colours sort of really have only emerged in the last few years. But even early on in his reign, I mean, he launched the anti-corruption drive, which he also used to lock up a lot of his political opponents. I think he had hundreds and hundreds of human rights lawyers arrested. So there was this immediate sort of clampdown, a bit of a human rights clampdown going on.
And when was that?
So that was early on. So he became president in 2012. So it was probably the year after that, 2013. So we sort of really started to see things like this happening, sort of the first signs of authoritarianism, I suppose. But I think the world really took notice in early 2018 when they changed the constitution and they abolished presidential term limits. So in China, every president since Mao or after Mao's time has only been allowed to serve 2 5-year terms as presidents. So these restrictions were put in place to prevent another, dictator-style ruler taking charge of China. That's exactly what they were for. But in 2018, a notice went out. We're changing the constitution. We're going to abolish that, which meant Xi Jinping could effectively be president for life. And look, everyone was pretty shocked. And I remember doing stories on this, and all all the local people I knew were sort of quietly very shocked. There was a lot of criticism on social media in China about this, which you don't often see. Of course, the censors moved in, and that was all erased by the next day. But Xi had he got rid of all his opponents. He had the confidence and he had the power to do this, and he's managed to get away with it. So, and then I think we've really seen since I guess the Trump era and the pandemic, this really, under Xi, this really nationalistic, confident, emboldened China emerge. And obviously China's really pushing back now against the US and against everyone else, and I think we're just going to see more of that.
So that explains, obviously, there is a maliciousness to the idea of abolishing term limits so you can stay in power. But it doesn't necessarily say that he's bad. What is it that is bad about Xi Jinping, and what policies is he driving down from the top that are bad?
Yeah, I mean, I think Xi would argue he had to abolish the term limits to ensure stability at a crucial time in China's history, and at a time when it's really making a comeback, and he has a lot of things that he wants to do. Yeah, I mean, in terms of bad things, I mean, I guess in terms of any government or any ruler being unaccountable is bad. I mean, he's completely unaccountable now. He presides over a system where he has no critics. No one can question his authority. If you question his authority, you end up in prison or worse.
That's bad.
I read an article somewhere I think recently, in The Columnist was sort of saying, he's surrounded. Oh, was it George Soros? I think wrote a good piece in the Financial Times, and he was saying, look, Xi's just surrounded himself by a bunch of yes men, and ultimately that's not good for the country. It could lead to the downfall of the country. So he seems to have. I mean, no one really knows what's going on up there in the inner sanctum of the Communist Party in Beijing. So he may have challenges, or he may have factions plotting to challenge him. But if that's going on, no one seems to know about it. So look, this is very unhealthy. The power structure in China is so centralized that it just can't be good for the system. You saw it happen in Wuhan earlier last year when COVID first emerged, and the local authorities there sort of tried to cover it up, and that's partly because the local officials would have been too terrified to report this bad news further up the chain because they knew they'd get into trouble. So you can see it affects the whole system, and look, and that's aside from all the human rights stuff. I mean, Xi Jinping's responsible for what's going on in Xinjiang, which must be one of the greatest human rights abuses going on in the world at the moment. So there's no doubt about that. And I think we saw a bit of a sign of just how ambitious and confident he is with what happened in Hong Kong last year in 2020, when China introduced these sort of very draconian national security laws in a bid to stamp out the protests once and for all. So all of those things don't paint a particularly rosy picture.
No, definitely not. Definitely not. And yeah, that's kind of how I thought about it as well. Obviously, anyone who wants to take control completely away from anyone who can tell you that you can't have control, and then you have the ability to tap people on the shoulder and put them away, and the ability to say, "Oh, are you a dissenter? Well, you're also going away." I mean, it's as bad as it gets. So, speaking about Xi Jinping and why he didn't turn left nor right, he turned bad because he changed the constitution so he had unlimited term limits, and he has enacted downwards all these terrible policies. Is there something particularly special about him? Is he a particularly good operator to have gotten to that position? And could you just speak about him as a politician, how effective he is?
Yeah, that's a really intriguing question, because the reality is we don't know a lot about Xi Jinping. I mean, someone remarked recently, no one's really written a biography about him, because there's the official biography, there's the official history. We know where he grew up, and we know about his family and his work history, etc. But we don't really know what the man's like, and we may never know what he's really like. But but in terms of being a leader, he's a very effective leader. I mean, you look at what he's done. He's got absolute control over a country of 1.4 billion people.
Yeah.
I mean, no one will question him. No one will stand up to him. I mean, I can't think of another regime in recent history where someone has so much power. We're not quite sure exactly how he's done this. He's obviously a pretty shrewd
Yeah.
guy to get where he has, but he has been very effective in many ways.
Yeah. So he is a particularly good politician. Why do you think it is that we know so little about him? Is that just because he can control the media that comes out about him? Is there any sort of like talk around Shanghai, Beijing, wherever you're operating, that perhaps there is like is there a weird side to him?
Yeah, I mean, this is how China works. So China's leaders, the Communist Party structure, you don't question them. You certainly don't criticize them. They don't do interviews. They don't do sit down media interviews. It just doesn't happen.
Hmm.
And look, it's always been like this. I mean, she's a very public figure. He's there's a cult of celebrity around him. His picture is absolutely everywhere. People have commemorative mugs and plates with his face on them in their homes. He does tour around the country and attract large crowds. So he's a very visible figure for sure. But in terms of, I've never heard him crack a joke or, when he does speak, it's a pre-prepared speech. I've never really heard him speak off the cuff, so it's
Hmm.
very hard to say what he's really like. And I've never really heard, I've met politicians in Australia, people like, Malcolm Turnbull
Sure.
and other politicians in Australia have met him. I mean, Malcolm Turnbull says he's a they were obviously speaking through an interpreter, but he said he's a very sharp guy.
How can you
But
know? Yeah.
yeah, but I've never heard any scandalous stories or
Right, right, right.
anything like that.
I
Yeah.
yeah. I guess it is sort of just like the sort of gossip that you might try to
Mm,
uncover about someone who intentionally
yeah.
shrouds himself in so much mystery. But
Yeah.
I just want to move on to talk about Xinjiang. This is the province in China where the Uyghur Muslims are now famously being re-educated, whatever that means. I had on recently to the podcast a man called Jeffrey Kane, who wrote a book called The Perfect Police State. I'm not sure if you're familiar with him or not.
Mm.
You went on a propaganda tour to this part of China, which sounded fascinating. So, could you explain to us what that was like?
Yeah, I mean, this is in 2018, I think, and we got invited to go to Xinjiang with 30 other journalists from all around the world, and it was a really tough call because I sat down with my editors and said, well, spoke to some other journalists in China. It's like, well, should we go? Because this is going to be a whole lot of propaganda, which we don't want to sort of really be involved with spreading. But I think we agreed that, look, it was getting really, really difficult for foreign journalists to go to Xinjiang. And if you did go, you were just constantly, you couldn't do anything. You couldn't do any reporting because you were just tailed by security
Hmm.
guys the whole time. So we thought, look, let's go and see what they're going to present us with. That they were promising to take us to the re-education camps. So I thought we've got to go and do this. And look, it was the most bizarre sort of 10 days of my life. It was a very strange experience. And flew into Urumqi, which is the capital of Xinjiang province, and it was sort of 10 days of singing. We just got carted around in these huge buses. It was 10 days of singing and dancing Uyghurs and going to markets and going to villages, and going to really elaborate light shows in opera houses, and everything was sort of really staged. So you go to all these events, and there'd be lots of Uyghurs in traditional dress,
Yeah.
sort of hanging around, smiling. But it just felt like you're in a giant stage production. It was like that movie, The Truman Show.
Hmm.
Um, really felt like that. And look, they did take us to two of the re-education camps, but they called them vocational training centres.
Hmm.
And look, they weren't real. I mean, they were all set up for us. And you go into this big complex out in the desert, and you drive in, and there were sort of flower gardens and people baking cookies in the kitchen, and you go up to the classrooms, and there'd be sort of 30 Uyghur kids in each classroom, studying, and then you're allowed to go and interview each one. And they all had sort of rehearsed lines and rehearsed stories that they would tell you, and they'd sit there and tell you things like, "Oh, we were behaving like heathens, and we were thinking really bad thoughts, and we wanted to kill more
Such yeah.
Muslims, and and we're really happy we're here now, and this is making us a better person," and all this kind of stuff. And it was, I remember after spending an afternoon there, getting back onto the bus, and I actually felt physically sick. I was sitting on the back of the bus thinking, the Chinese government's using the Uyghur people to propagate this false narrative about these people. And the worst thing was, a couple of the other journalists on the trip believed it. I mean, I had the advantage. I'd spent a lot
That's
of
wild. How could they
I'd,
believe it?
I'd been living in China, so I'd sort of seen propaganda being used
Mm.
before, but there were sort of some journalists who were just flying in for this trip, and they sort of, because it was so elaborate, the resources they threw at this, they just thought it was real, and there was
Yeah.
no problem in Xinjiang at all.
Wow. Can you rationalize how they didn't see through what was, on the surface, very blatant, like cover up?
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe they'd never, maybe they weren't skeptical enough, or maybe they hadn't had enough experience, or they weren't aware of what the Chinese government's capable of when it comes to
Right.
propaganda and the resources they can throw at this kind of thing. And it got a bit heated. I think after about the first 4 or 5 days, we get a bit heated in the evenings when you'd be having a few beers with the journalists, and there's some heated discussions would erupt between the journalists that knew it was sort of all bullshit, and those that didn't, and started defending the Chinese government, and you're sort of like going, oh, and
Yeah, I
that's
can
sort of
imagine.
what it was, really interesting exercise, because that's what the Chinese government wanted to happen.
Hmm.
They wanted us to go home and write nice stories about how life was wonderful in Xinjiang, and it was a really hard story to report on. And in the end, I wrote a big piece. I wrote what I saw, and then I wrote why I didn't think it was true.
Yeah.
And then I interviewed a lot of Uyghurs in exile overseas who could tell you their truths, and put that into the story.
Oh, that's amazing. I wasn't aware that you had also interviewed firsthand people that had gone through the re-education.
Yeah,
How
yeah,
did their stories impact the way that you thought about China, since this was a country that you do still like or live in and
yeah.
perhaps even love? How do you deal with that cognitive dissonance?
Yeah, it was sort of this real dilemma living in China, because I kind of loved the country, and I loved the people, and I loved working in China, and it's so interesting.
Hmm.
And then you'd have these days though where you felt so angry about what was going on, and I was very angry about what happened in Hong Kong. I'm very have very close ties to Hong Kong, so that was a real dilemma for me. And you'd get, obviously quite angry about what was happening in Xinjiang, and but also other experiences I had where I sort of saw ordinary people being censored, or a dissident I'd interviewed being locked up. So there are a lot of things to make you really angry, and I found it hardest when I was interacting with my Chinese friends, and in the end, you sort of don't talk about politics very much to your Chinese friends, because some really did understand what was happening, but a lot didn't really quite get what was happening, and it was sort of too awkward to explain, and you don't want to go around dissing someone's country the whole time either. So that was a bit of a conundrum the whole time living in China. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, I can imagine. Jeff Raby said the same.
I
Want
know Jeff
to
quite well. Jeff was my neighbour until he moved back to Beijing
Was he
in
actually? Okay, well
in
there you go.
Sydney.
That's
Yeah,
amazing.
yeah, yeah.
What was it like hanging out with him? Because he had this great experience of being like a, economic consultant before he was the diplomat.
Mm.
What was it like speaking to him about the living through and overseeing the wild economic growth of China?
Yeah. Oh, Jeff's a fascinating character, and I got to know him through my work, obviously. But then when I moved back to Sydney, he was living in the same street as me, so we hung out quite a lot. But
Oh, how about
I
that?
mean, Jeff's
Nice.
just fascinating, because you don't get a lot of former diplomats who are so outspoken, to be frank. I mean, they can be pretty conservative, and Jeff's very outspoken, and he obviously loves China, and he's got all this color and all these great stories about his time there as an ambassador, and he was also there, during Tiananmen Square and some really pivotal moments in Chinese history. So his insights are sort of just fascinating. Yeah.
I mean, for sure, he's one of a few Australians who really developed the relationship between Australia and China. That's a that alone is a life, that
Yeah.
experience, and that's very, very cool, I thought.
Yeah.
Speaking of Australians, we haven't touched on the drama of your book. We speak a lot about China and your experiences in China, but something that I thought was very interesting about the story was that you weren't, and you say this yourself, you weren't expelled from the country because of anything you did specifically. You didn't break some wild story. You weren't holding, at least to our knowledge, any secret information. And, the reason you actually ended up being removed from this country was because the relationships between our nation, Australia, and China. So what happened to cause this escalation? Because before COVID, we were like best mates, but it seems to be going really, really
Yeah.
bad.
Yeah, it was a really sad way to leave China because, I mean, I've known journalists over the years who did get deported from China because they had these cracking stories where they uncovered some real dirt about China, and I'm ashamed to say I didn't do that, but what happened was, I mean, I was me and the other journalist Bill Birtles. I mean, we were just complete pawns in a political game, really,
Right.
and we were the only two journalists left in China at the time writing for Australian media outlets because there are a couple of other correspondents, but because of COVID, they couldn't get back in. So we were targeted purely because of our connection to Australia. But the relationship, yeah, you're right. The relationship was pretty rosy for many, many years. I remember when Xi Jinping visited Australia, it must have been, it was maybe just before he became president around that time. And, I remember he went down to Tasmania, my hometown, and all the kids are at the airport waving Chinese flags. And he gave a speech in the Australian Parliament. So we're all very chummy for many years. And of
Yeah.
course, we had this very important trading relationship, and China signed its first free trade agreement with Australia, and Australia's obviously has been hugely reliant on China for our economic growth. And it just all totally turned on its heels around sort of 2017. I mean, a lot of China watchers, people who've been following this for decades, say it was inevitable that things would eventually sour because our ideologies are so different. And it sort of happened during Xi's time. There was, I think, the initial concerns about foreign interference in Australia. Australia became one of the first countries in the world to sort of push back on this Chinese soft power, this foreign interference, and we saw it with a couple of the political bribery scandals. Malcolm Turnbull introduced the foreign interference laws, and we banned Huawei. So we were sort of starting to get on China's nerves, and I think the Australian government had some very legitimate concerns about security and the direction China was heading at the same time. But obviously, it really came to the fore in after the pandemic. So in April last year, and the Morrison government made the call for the investigation to origins of coronavirus, and that seemed to be the tipping point for China. I think Australia was already in China's bad books for many reasons. We were seen as a bit of a troublemaker amongst the Western democracies, encouraging other countries to push back on China. But that tipped them over the edge, and then they started putting restrictions on some of our trade and what have you. And look, at the moment, the relationship is so bad that there seems to be no turning back, and all of that was reflected with what happened to Bill Birtles and myself. So it was all tied up really with the souring relationship. It was a bit of a tit for tat response to something that happened in back in June last year, maybe June or July last year, when ASIO, the Australian intelligence authorities, raided the homes of four Chinese journalists in Sydney. You know, dawn raids, searched their houses, searched their laptops, etc.
Hmm.
That wasn't public at the time, so we didn't know this had happened.
Hmm.
And it turns out this is why China decided, they said, well, we're going to go and harass your journalists now. And that's exactly what happened. And I think that's the main reason.
That's such a shame. That's the reason it all comes to an end as well. Um, you said something very interesting there. You don't think there's a way back. You know, how firmly do you make that assertion? Are we really done with like friendly diplomatic relations with China?
Yeah, it's just, can't say that for sure. It's just
Mm,
hard at the moment to see how we can get back to where we were. There's so much. I mean, China's really changed. It's changed a lot in the last few years. I mean, and some of the rhetoric that's now been, the hostile rhetoric that's been exchanged between both countries. It's really hard to see us getting past that. It's not just Australia, of course. I mean, China's, you know, there's friction between China and many other countries, particularly the US at the moment. And look, to be honest, everything that happens to us, it's all pivotal on the US-China relationship. I think if the US and China suddenly became very friendly again, Australia probably would be in with a good chance. But
yeah, yeah.
it just seems to be going the other direction. Things seems to be getting more and more hostile. We haven't seen any more sort of trade sanctions or trade restrictions in the last 6 months or so, but I think China's sort of stated it doesn't want to buy so much of our iron ore,
Hmm.
and when the borders reopen, I mean, China could stop its students from coming here. We don't
Hmm.
quite know how they're going to react there. So, but I think the economic damage to which Australia is going to be quite uh, great from this sort of the severing of this
Yeah.
relationship. But I think on an ideological level, our government certainly, and I think a lot of the public in Australia don't want to be friends with China anymore. They don't trust it.
How will the economic damage manifest? How will the average guy living in Penrith, Brisbane, Perth, how will they be affected by the slowing trade between China and Australia, or the more difficult trade?
Yeah, because so far, I mean, China's slapped restrictions on Australian wine and barley and beef and cotton and coal and a whole bunch of exports, but overall our exports to China have continued to grow every month, and I think
Interesting. Okay.
they're still at record highs, but
Mm,
that's been driven largely by iron ore price. So iron ore prices have been going through the roof.
hmm.
So China still needs our iron ore. It just can't really get it from anywhere else except
Hmm.
Brazil, and Brazil had its own problems earlier this year. So iron ore sort of really prop things up. So the risk now, I guess, is if iron ore's hit, that could actually cause enough damage to the budgets of governments like the West Australian government and the federal government, and that would be a big enough blow to perhaps filter its way through down to sort of ordinary Australians. It's just the government just wouldn't have as much in its reserves as it would have otherwise.
Hmm.
I mean, Geoff Raby, I remember he said once that Australians have to realise if we completely severed ties with China, every Australian would have to, our standard of living would drop. I mean, I don't know how much by. And of course, we can still export to other countries, and
Hmm.
it's a big world out there. It's just hard for any other single country to replace China.
Yeah, and we're not geographically located in a particularly good spot to sell things,
No,
are we? You know, it costs a lot to take it anywhere else.
yeah,
Which I think is why my opinion at least is we made a very sort of outlandish kind of tough guy approach. We want to say no one pushes around Australia, even though we're the underdog, even though we're not a big economic superpower. We're going to stand up for the human rights abuses in China. We're going to stand up for the fact that we're going to say that perhaps this virus came out of a lab rather than a random, rather than a wet market. We're going to make these statements, big, brash statements, because we're honest Australians. This is kind of like the undertones for why it was so brash. Do you think that it was still the right course of action that we took, or perhaps, like what Geoff Raby thinks, a more, realism, a little bit more of a slimy diplomacy would have been a better course of action?
Yeah, that's right. Because I think you can. I think at times we're not very diplomatic sometimes, or our current government hasn't been that diplomatic when it comes to China. I mean, you can argue you don't have to suck up to China. We've got our own ideological beliefs we have to protect. We've got a way of life to protect. There's really genuine security concerns about China, and the Morrison government will argue, look, why can't we stand up and say there should be an inquiry into this pandemic, which has affected every country in the world? But I think the way we handled it could have been more diplomatic. It could have been better. Could have been done a bit more softly. And you can still take the actions necessary. You can still take these actions against China that have to happen. You can still ban Huawei, and that probably wasn't a bad decision. But in terms of sort of, Maurice Payne, the foreign minister, suddenly appearing on a Sunday morning television show and announcing they want an international inquiry into coronavirus, which is going to really, really upset the country's biggest trading partner. And it just felt like it wasn't thought through. It was a major policy announcement. It was announced in a very strange way. China complains it wasn't consulted. So I just think, I mean, China's very sensitive, and there's the whole saving face thing, and you've got to take all that into consideration when
Yeah.
dealing with China. Other countries do it pretty well. The Japanese do it pretty well, and it
Hmm.
seems like we fumbled there. And China gets really grumpy as well because we have all these very outspoken backbenchers in the Senate and elsewhere, sort of mouthing off about China. And of course, it's a democracy, and we've got free speech, so of course you're allowed to.
Hmm.
But sometimes that plays very, very badly with China as well. So look, I'm not saying we've done the wrong thing and we shouldn't stand up for our values, but we can maybe do it a bit more sensitively.
Yeah, especially when you consider just how reliant on China we are. It's not like it's a big part of our trade portfolio. It's the part of our trade portfolio that you can't piss off. And it's like, perhaps maybe a smaller ego leading the nation might have dealt with this a little bit more subtly. And who knows what the long term outcome is going to be, but it just definitely feels like in the short term that we are, we're entering into a fight as a huge underdog. We
Yes.
weigh half what the other guys weigh.
Yeah, I mean, this talk of when you get politicians talking about going to war with China, it's like, why are you
Yes,
even bringing that up? That's just
exactly.
crazy.
That was actually the next question I was going to ask
Right.
you.
Yeah.
How do you agree with me, in an effort to be a bit controversial, but it is stupid for Canberra to deliver war rhetoric. There is no upside to it.
No, with this speech by Michael Paluzzo, senior government official, he talked about the drums of war were beating with China. That raised a lot of eyebrows. And I mean, I think what the Australian government was trying to do was they're trying to send a message out there that if China tries to do something in Taiwan, we will support the US. I think the US is probably encouraging its allies as well to put a lot of pressure on China, so they can say, we've got a lot of allies here. Don't do anything silly, or we're going to try and stop you. I think that's sort of what's going on here.
Hmm.
But yeah, it sent out some very strange signals, and obviously you don't want to be talking about going to war with anyone, let alone
Mm, mm,
China.
mm.
So I just don't know why you'd put it out there. It just seems just seems crazy. Yeah.
Yeah, it seems like just something you would say for your own political benefit, even though it does have a huge downside.
Yeah.
Do you think that Taiwan will eventually be sort of like a catalyst for some sort of military intervention, whether it be from China announcing some sort of independence and then maybe China reacting and then the West stepping in, or some other scenario? Do you think that that Taiwan has that potential, or do you think all of the emphasis on the Taiwan issue is kind of overemphasized?
Yeah, I mean, I hope, I really hope it doesn't. Um, and the Taiwan issue, there has been a lot of emphasis on the Taiwan issue lately. There is a bit of misreporting out there at times. There are headlines that make it sound like China's on the cusp of invading China and they're about to roll in the PLA and it's all going to kick off next week. And I really don't think we're at that point yet. I mean, there's no sign that China's sort of mobilizing the forces to roll in there. There's the language that China uses around Taiwan hasn't changed dramatically in the last few years. I mean, there have been a lot more sort of air incursions into Taiwan's defense zone. There's a lot more saber rattling going on, and then the US is also doing its fair share. So the tensions there are definitely escalating. But it was interesting. I was speaking to some people in Taiwan earlier this week, and they said they don't think about it that much. I said,
Really?
are
Yeah.
you worried? And they said, no, we don't. We're just more worried about COVID at the moment and the economy. So they're not people aren't losing sleep in their beds in Taipei at the moment. But I think in this day and age, things have become so hostile between the US and China, and then you just don't know what China's going to do next. I mean, we never would have anticipated the Hong Kong national security laws, and Xi Jinping seems very confident, so it sort of makes you wonder, what China might do. But I like to think China's clever enough to play the long game here. They will probably eventually have some kind of control over Taiwan. It might be years away, and they might do it through more subtler means, such as domestic political change within Taiwan, that kind of thing. So I really hope this doesn't lead to a conflict. But a lot of people are talking about it, and anything's possible at the moment.
You mentioned Hong Kong there. You spend quite a bit of time romanticizing Hong Kong in the book, because you had what seemed to be just some great times there years ago, well before
Yeah.
the what's unraveled in the last few years. Could you explain just how dramatic the change has been in Hong Kong as like
Yeah.
an allegory to say how pernicious China's influence can be, and also potentially make that comparison to Taiwan?
Yeah. Yeah, no, Hong Kong's a very personal story for me because I moved there when I was young and starry. I was probably like 22, left Tasmania, flew into Hong Kong, worked as a journalist there. So it was really big part of my life. And my partner's Hong Kong Chinese, so had very close ties to the place. But I guess
Mm,
it really hit me in 2019 when the protests started. So for me, Hong Kong's always been this safe place, very autonomous from mainland China. Nothing like the Hong Kong Chinese are nothing like the mainland Chinese, and Hong Kong's always been this sort of free spirited, sort of creative, business hub, very international city, and it sort of really hit me in 2019 flying down there, and the protests had just started and running around the streets of Central, and there's tear gas going on, and people running around screaming, and it was sort
mm,
of like, God, I feel unsafe in Hong Kong. And I mean, Hong Kong's was always one of the safest cities in the world.
mhm,
And that's when it really hit me that Hong Kong was really changing. And then, of course, you had, this huge protest movement through the second half of 2019. And at one stage, it looked like the people had stood up to the Hong Kong government, the Chinese government, and they were going to get their way. And then, of course, that didn't happen. And ultimately, what we saw last year with China introduced these national security laws, sort of really much overnight. No one saw it coming, and the whole city became this sort of police state very quickly, and it sort of really upsets me that you've got an entire population of people who've woken up overnight and they don't have free speech anymore. They don't have a free press, and they're sort of got to abide by communist China's rules, and they've got to be very careful what they do or say, and if they don't, they'll be locked up. And this is a reality in mainland China, but I think people there have grown up with this system and they're used to this system and don't question it. But you've got 7 million people in Hong Kong who this has been thrust on them sort of very, very quickly. But I guess it's interesting because I was in Hong Kong for the handover in 1997, and the mood was actually quite optimistic. I mean, people had their concerns about China after Tiananmen Square, but they seem to have evaporated. And but it's just in the last couple of years, I think everyone's darkest fears about Hong Kong did actually come true.
Yeah. And do you see any comparison potentially for Taiwan between the Hong Kong attitude and the Taiwanese attitude?
Yeah, there's sort of some parallels in the fact that China and Britain agreed on this one country, two systems model for Hong Kong, which meant obviously Hong Kong would have its own independent judiciary and political system and etc. But China would sort of ultimately, it was ultimately China's territory, and that system seemed to work for a little while, and then China and under Xi Jinping was promoting the same idea for Taiwan. So back in, I think, sort of 2018, 2017, the assumption was that Taiwan would eventually move to a similar system as Hong Kong.
Hmm.
But then Xi Jinping shot himself in the foot because then everyone in Taiwan saw what happened in Hong Kong during the protests, and it scared the hell out of them. So in early 2020, they voted Tsai Ing-wen, the current president of Taiwan. They voted her back in, and she's very not anti-China, but she wants Taiwan to
Pro Taiwan for sure. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
pro-Taiwan. And sort of under her rule, there's a real pushback against China, and I think people in Taiwan are very, very scared that because they don't trust the Chinese government anymore. They don't believe the Chinese government will let them remain independent. They're a democracy.
Yeah.
They share very similar values to us,
Hmm.
and they know now that under Chinese rule that will all be eroded. So I think they're all
Yeah.
pretty terrified.
It's so interesting that you said that when you spoke with someone in Taiwan at the beginning of the week, they don't even think about it. I had the same comment from Angelica Wang, who maybe you're familiar with. She's a very prominent journalist on Twitter. She was on the podcast, and she said the exact same thing. She's out there trying to talk to people about it, trying to get their takes, and trying to emphasize how big of an issue it is. And they're just like, I'm going to work. I don't sort of think about it. Do you think it was similar with the Hong Kong? I don't want to say nationals, but the people that lived in Hong Kong, did they similarly just think that's too impossible? It's not going to happen. Like, is there a naivety to the Taiwanese people, or do they just have a better understanding of it than we do?
Yeah, I think Hong Kong was probably. I don't think it's just Taiwan. I think Hong Kong was the same. I mean, I think people always had their deep-seated concerns about China, but I don't think any of the protesters saw what was going to happen. I mean, I don't think the protesters realised that by doing what it would, that would trigger a chain of events that would lead to the national security laws coming in this sort of this sort of police state. These huge changes happening in Hong Kong. So, a lot of people say, look, they're being naive. It was always inevitable. This would have always happened. It just happened a lot
Yeah.
quicker. So, yeah. So I guess I think in many respects, you've also just got to go on living and go about your day-to-day business,
Hmm.
or else you'll go crazy thinking about it. And then, I mean, issues do get maybe overemphasized in the media. I think a lot of awful things are happening in Hong Kong, but if you flew into Hong Kong today, COVID aside, people are still going out and shopping and going about their daily business. So it's not this sort of giant dystopian dark place.
Yeah.
So we can, I think, sometimes when you just read media coverage of an issue, it does sort of emphasize everything quite dramatically. But
Yeah.
yeah,
And
but Taiwan's interesting. Yeah, I don't get this. I think I think the Taiwanese government's very concerned,
mhm,
but the Taiwanese people, I think, just sort of getting on with it day by day.
yeah. Maybe there is also the normalization of it as well. Like you said in your book, when you went to Xinjiang, it was particularly egregious how there was constantly an SUV following you everywhere you go, and they were, spies, right? They weren't people weren't like, "Hey, Michael, these guys are going to follow us." They just happened to be following you. And you said even in your hometown when you would go around, every now and again you'd sort of see a guy who was in charge of sort of just reporting on you, following you, and he was a spy, spook, whatever. And you just sort of said very flippantly, it was normalized. It wasn't a big deal anymore. And I wanted to ask you how you rationalize that, but I think what would be better is just to make that comparison. Maybe that's how the Taiwanese people feel about China. For people outside who aren't necessarily interacting with China every single day, it's crazy. Like how could you not feel unsafe? But instead, these things just get normalized, and maybe that's
Yeah,
how everyone's coping.
I think so. But I think in China, a majority of ordinary Chinese people, I don't think they walk around going, "Oh my God, there's cameras everywhere. There's people watching me. Government's going to come after me." I think that there's probably an underlying level of anxiety. You know, if you do the wrong thing, you'll get into trouble. But I don't think ordinary Chinese people either go around sort of trembling in fear at all times,
Hmm.
depending on who you are. But it is, you sort of do get normalised, and I guess working there as a journalist, there were some days that were quite unsettling. There were other days where you just didn't worry about it. I mean, friends used to joke that, because I worked in a house which was also journalists have been living there for 16 years, and everyone used to joke that, "Oh, your house is bugged." And I know my mobile phone was bugged because it'd make sort of strange clicking noises when you were
Interesting.
talking to
Okay.
someone. And in the end, you just thought, well, I can't get too paranoid about this, and really, I'm not really hiding anything. If I have any, if I get any good information, I just report it anyway. So you just got to take a deep breath and go, well, I'm just not going to worry about this. And
Hmm.
you have to manage some things if you're speaking to, you've got to protect your sources. So if you're speaking to maybe, say, a dissident, for example, you've got to assume you're being watched. So you've got to be very careful about sort of protecting them. That's
Yep.
the
Yep.
main time that you would think about it. Yeah.
You just mentioned how your phone was bugged. The great thing about your book is how much of a like insight it is to what it is like living in China. For example, you have this anecdote where you're randomly drug tested in a restaurant, and that's there's one example. There's so many great examples that give someone an insight into what it's like to live there. And I'm also in your introduction going to explain how you do get a knock on the door the day before you're supposed to leave.
Yeah.
So we're not going to forget about that drama and everything. But I
No.
didn't want to. I don't want to give away everything, right? There is nothing that beats the original text. And so obviously people will need to go into that. And you have been so generous with your time. I hope you would allow just a few more questions.
Yeah,
And these
sure.
are more of some of the sort of exciting experiences you report on. So do you want to do that?
Yeah,
Do you have time
yeah,
for it?
totally. Yeah, yeah.
Okay. So, something that stood out to me, well, two things that stood out to me. Your very unusual night in North Korea, and then your wedding straight out of Crazy Rich Asians. So, could you start with North Korea and just explain what this taught you about this region? China, North Korea, South Korea, like how everything's sort of working there.
Yeah, that was one of my favorite reporting trips or most interesting reporting trips. And um, so Donald Trump was due to meet Kim Jong Un in Singapore for this sort of historic summit in a few weeks' time, and we wanted to get into the North Korea story and find out what was going on. And there's this city in northern China called Dandong, and it's right on the border of North Korea. It's the only place where there's this sort of access to North Korea, and there was this sort of bizarre property boom going on in this city, very Chinese, huge skyscrapers, ghost cities going up right on the border of this no man's land, looking over into the fields of
So
North
wild.
Korea.
Yeah.
So, and we went to this town, and it was this really quirky city. There's sort of this big promenade. There's a sort of a river, and on the other side of the river is North Korea, and there's sort of guard towers, and there's peasants hoeing the fields, and it does look like, the stereotype. It looks like a very poor country and very bleak. And then on my side of the river, the Chinese side, there's neon lights everywhere and Chinese tourists in Gucci outfits, and they're all hiring speedboats and going out to take photos of the peasants hoeing the fields on the other side of the river. So it
So
was a
wild.
really bizarre experience, and it just highlighted, China, this very rich, powerful country, and and its tourists are just sort of being voyeurs and looking over the border at the struggling old North Korea.
And
So
there
it was
wasn't
a
like
really
an
interesting.
ethical question. People were like, sympathizing how horrible this is. How can we help them? It was more just like,
No.
look at these poor people. How
Yeah,
interesting.
it was a bit of a circus show, really,
Yeah.
yeah, it wasn't. I wasn't that comfortable with it, and I mean, we went out in a boat for journalistic purposes and with a photographer and took photos of all this, and we just had this sort of scary moment where the speedboat engine conked out and we started drifting into North Korea. And these soldiers were running down towards the riverbank and they had
Yeah.
guns and we're like, shit. But anyway, we got the engine started and got out of there.
That could have
But
gotten hairy, eh? I mean, people get shot on sight all the time doing that sort of stuff, don't they?
well, up on North Korean soil, that would have been a diplomatic disaster.
Yeah, I think so.
I think I would have been in huge trouble. Um, but yeah, what else can I say about that?
Well, the nighttime turned particularly weird, I thought.
Yeah, so we went to so in this city of Dandong, there's a whole lot of restaurants, North Korean restaurants. So they're manned by these North Korean waitresses who are brought over from the border to work, and they wear the traditional sort of North Korean dresses. And it was quite weird going for dinner there. And we tried to interview them, and you're not allowed to talk to them. They're not allowed to talk to members of the public. They're really shuttered away from the public in China. And then there was a huge banquet, and then there are these weird variety shows where troops of women are playing saxophones and guitars, and there's laser light shows, and it was all very surreal.
Just adding to the ethnic minorities, the Uyghur Muslims, the Inner Mongolians, the Tibetans, and many others. It's also worth saying part of China's human rights abuses is their enablement of North Korea, because North Korea would not exist as North Korea in such dire famine were it not for China's protection, and exploitation of slave labor, which is also documented. Did you, in your time there, learn much about this dynamic to add to the conversation about it?
Yeah, I mean, realistically, China is Kim Jong Un, and North Korea's only real ally of any importance. But it's sort of this, they have a very uneasy relationship. I mean, I don't think China really likes having a nuclear power on its doorstep with perhaps a potential madman sitting there threatening to push the button all the time. So I think China's sort of got real security concerns about North Korea, but I think China feels like it can control North Korea at the same time. So it doesn't necessarily enable North Korea, but it could probably do more to stop what's going on there.
Hmm.
I mean, it does abide by UN sanctions on North Korea officially. We think unofficially it probably doesn't. It's probably trading with North Korea, and I think China looks at North Korea as a bit of sorry. I think China looks on North Korea as a bit of Afghanistan, a potential opportunity if the country opened up sort of economically, and
Okay,
it's got
interesting.
resources there. So I think it's sort of biding its time a bit there with North Korea. And of course, North Korea is the West's enemy and the US enemy, and in a way that makes it China's friend.
Yeah, right. Not a very natural transition, but from the depravity of North Korea, you attended what is a wedding straight out of Crazy Rich Asians. And the takeaway from this story for me was just the unbelievable wasting of money and wealth, all for the shallow signaling value that it gives. So you ended up on the guest list here. I can't remember how, but I think it was quite serendipitous. You weren't like particularly friends with anyone there, but could you explain what this wedding was, just to highlight for us what kind of wealth exists in China and in Asia more broadly?
Yeah, this was a few years ago. I found myself at a what I call the ultimate crazy rich Asian wedding.
Mm.
We all know the movie or the book of the same name, and I ended up there because my partner and a bunch of his friends knew the bride from years ago. So the bride was from a very wealthy Hong Kong family. She married an extremely wealthy mainland Chinese man. I'm not allowed to say their names. And we were invited to this wedding in Rome, and we thought, why not let's go? And I think
100%. Yeah.
we were the only people that flew economy class to Rome. I think everyone else had private jets, and it was just I never experienced such an obscene display of wealth. You know, they booked out this sort of lavish hotel in the middle of Rome. It was all paid for, and the hotel was just full of bodyguards. And then every night there was a different themed event. But the first night we all put on tuxedos and we were chauffeur driven to um,
The Vatican.
we were we were chauffeur driven to the Vatican, and we went on a private tour of the Sistine Chapel. So there's only a
So
couple of
unreal.
hundred wedding guests
Yeah.
wandering through the Sistine Chapel, and it was and then afterwards we went to this sort of palace for dinner, and it's chandeliers, and it's the most opulent stuff you've ever seen. And
Yeah.
over the course of the next 3 nights, there were live circus performers, and there was a film set done out like a Roman city, and there were famous musicians would turn up like Missy Elliott and Bruno Mars, and they were performing, and there was just a lot of money kind of washing around in this place, and
Mm.
I think I was at the bottom of the pile there. I remember at a dinner I was chatting to an Australian woman, and and I said, "Well, what are you doing here?" And she said, "Oh, I'm married to their personal vet. He's a vet for rich people,
Yeah.
and when they go on trips on their personal yachts, the vet's flown in to look after the animals on their yachts because the animals
What a
can't go
gig.
into shore." Yeah. But anyway, it was a little bit of an insight into this sort of. It was just before I moved to Shanghai, so it was a bit of an insight into this huge accumulation of wealth that had
Yeah.
taken place in China, and it was a period when it was still okay to be wealthy and to flaunt your wealth. So there was a lot of money being splashed around.
And has that died off now? Just coupling down what we said about Jack Ma, that sort of
Yeah.
display would be a bit
So I
uns-
think that kind of ostentatious, I mean, this happened in Rome and not China
Mm.
anyway, but I think that real ostentatious display of wealth has really cooled down in China. I mean, you still see Lamborghinis everywhere in Shanghai and stuff like that, but you certainly don't see billionaire CEOs doing magazine interviews with spreads on their private mansions. None of that kind of stuff. I think if you
sure.
have a lot of wealth, you keep it a bit on the low down these
Mm.
days.
Well, look, Michael, we've really done a trip around your life in China and Hong Kong. I said this to you before we started recording off air, but I really romanticize the idea of the foreign correspondent and the journalist who is, told to report on the news of a country and supported, and then through the connections of the Australian Financial Review, it opens doors, right? You get to meet other people that you wouldn't otherwise. You get to live next to Jeff
Right.
Raby. You get to I think it's very fascinating, and it all comes through in the book, which is so amazing. But obviously, we've spoken about good times, interesting times, crazy times, also a lot of bad things about China. You were kicked out of this country. How do you think about it now? Is it still a thrilling place for you? Is it a place you wish to return to and perhaps even work in?
Yeah, it was a really upsetting way to leave because, I had a whole bunch of stuff I still wanted to do there, a whole lot of places I wanted to go. I had a lot of friends there I never got to say goodbye to, and it was a really awful way to end what had been a great experience. And I must admit now, I would like to go back to China someday. I just think at the moment I probably wouldn't go. I don't think my company would let me go now.
Too
I might be
risky.
able to fly back there tomorrow and nothing might happen to me. You
Uh-huh.
just don't know.
Hmm.
And also I think it's become a very even since I've left, it's become a harder place for foreign journalists or any journalists to work. A lot of foreign journalists were really harassed recently when they were reporting on some flooding in central China. So I think increasingly it's probably becoming a really unpleasant place
Right.
to be a journalist. I'd like to go back one day. Still really interested in what's going on there, but it's just not the right time at the moment.
Yeah. Okay. Well, it's a shame to hear that the relation
Yeah.
degenerated so badly. Finally, Michael, two questions, and these are baseline that I ask everyone. So, you might have seen, but the podcast is more of like a geopolitical show,
Yeah.
and so the first question is always, what is a country that you're very bullish on, most bullish on, in fact?
Oh my God, I haven't thought about that. um, Crikey, because everywhere's a bit of a mess at the moment, isn't it?
Mm,
Well, I might say Japan only because I hope to be moving there in the next couple of months and
yeah.
continue my reporting there. I mean, it just seems like a very stable. It's got its sort of own problems, but it seems like a very stable,
Mm,
culturally rich, fascinating country that at the same time is still very open to the West and the rest of the world. So I'll just say Japan.
nice. Yeah, one of the greatest economic success stories of history, right? I mean, they don't have
Yeah,
natural resources to fall back on. They have a bunch of islands. It's hard to build infrastructure there. Yet, nonetheless, I think they're the third
yeah,
biggest economy in the world still, and they have
yeah,
terrible demographic. Like they've got seemingly everything working against them.
yeah,
But remarkable country.
yeah.
Finally, another question which I'm sure you haven't thought about before, but if you could witness a conversation between any two people of history, okay, so dead or alive, different ages, it doesn't matter, what would make like a fascinating podcast?
Oh God. Um, in all of history, crikey.
Just to keep it narrow for you.
Yeah, yeah. Um, I'd have to say, I'd have to say someone like, well, maybe Xi Jinping and somebody else, just because I know I'm never going to get to hear Xi Jinping
Hmm.
talk about things openly. So I'd just like to know what he would say.
Yeah.
Um, oh God, but who would it be with? I don't know. Xi Jinping and Donald Trump.
Donald Trump. Okay. Jeff said Xi Jinping and Theodore Roosevelt.
Oh,
Um,
right.
but yeah, okay.
That's good.
Well, Michael, really, I couldn't, be more grateful. I truly mean that
Yeah,
for to give me 2 hours of your time, and
yeah.
I think that was really good as well. Your book's terrific, which I'll say again,
Yeah, thanks for
and
your interest. Yeah,
yeah, and no, really, people should go out and read it. Most of my
yeah,
audience is in America,
right,
so unfortunately, there's not many Australians that are tuning in, which is a shame, since
right.
we are the ones that have the relationship with China that is most fascinating. But
Okay. Well, when
um,
it comes out, I'll tweet you a bit and try and get your following up.
oh,
Yeah,
that'd be absolutely unreal. So
yeah,
yes, Michael, thank you so much, and
yeah.
have a good one.
Thanks very much, Ryan.
So Michael Smith, what a terrific guy. We had some technical issues halfway through, which was frustrating because it does affect the rhythm a little bit, especially when you get into a bit of a vein of conversation. But that's okay. We ended up answering the G question multiple times because the tech was failing us so bad. But still, I hope you enjoy that. I'm always worried about speaking too much about the contents of a guest's book, because there is this slight chance that you can like overshare, and then it sort of reaches that precipice in the listener's. It reaches that precipice for the listener as to whether they should invest further time into buying the original text itself and the actual book itself, when they feel like maybe they got the stories and the main thesis just from a podcast. So for that reason, despite the fact we covered so much of what he went through, there is actually there's actually loads more in the book as well, in terms of Michael's experiences in China and in Asia more generally. Now, Michael's going to go to Japan and be the Australian Financial Review's Japanese correspondent. I mean, what a terrific job. Very, very cool. So look, you guys stuck around to the end. Cheers so much. It really does mean the world to me. I'm writing a lot online, so visit the website atlasgeographica.com. Subscribe to the newsletter, which goes out very non-occasionally. And also, if you are interested in the ideas of Nassim Taleb, I do have a podcast that looks into sort of the incerto, risk, randomness, probability, uncertainty, and try to unpack a lot of the ideas that Nassim brings forth in that fantastic 5-book series. Cheers for listening. Ciao.